Imagine if you had the ability to see when someone would die, not just a vague premonition, but with terrifying certainty. In this hospital, a man holds the greatest secret that has never been revealed, until death comes knocking on every door he passes. Is this a curse or a blessing? And how could he live with such dark knowledge? Prepare yourself to enter a world where mystery and death unite in ways you never imagined before. This is a true story experienced by the author himself. In the midst of mental and physical exhaustion, after months of sleeping on hard benches in a hospital ward, the author was told exactly when the suffering patients behind the closed doors of a cancer hospital would die. Not just an estimate, but the precise date and time. How does the story unfold? Let's find out together. But first, please click the subscribe button and like this video. Lin Tang, a man in his early 30s, lived what seemed to be an ordinary life. He worked as a data analyst at a company whose office was located next to a large hospital. Lin Tang was known as a hardworking, quiet individual who always tried to maintain a balance between his work and personal life. However, that balance began to waver when his father fell seriously ill and had to be intensively treated at the hospital. A few months ago, his father was diagnosed with a rare and difficult-to-treat disease. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and the doctors decided that he needed to be hospitalized for an indefinite period. As an only child, Lin Tang felt responsible for taking care of his father. He didn't think twice about spending his nights at the hospital, even if it meant sleeping on the hard waiting chairs. Every day, Lin Tang's routine was the same. In the morning, he would go to the office, which was just a few steps away from the hospital. After work, he would head straight to his father's ward. There, he would sit by his father's bedside, read a book, or simply hold his hand, hoping that his presence could bring some comfort to his father who was battling the illness. As night fell, Lin Tang would sleep on a long chair in the corner of the room, trying his best not to disturb his father's sleep. As time went on, physical and emotional exhaustion began to overwhelm Lin Tang. His sleep was restless, and his mind was always filled with worry about his father's condition. However, amidst all this, Lin Tang began to notice something strange. Every time he walked past the hospital wards, his gaze would always be drawn to the doors of the wards where the critically ill patients were being treated. On each of those doors, Lin Tang saw an unusual shadow. At first, he didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it was just an effect of his exhaustion. But the more often he saw the shadow, the clearer it became that something was amiss. On every door of a ward where a gravely ill patient was being treated, Lin Tang saw the shadow of a calendar showing a specific date and a clock with hands frozen at a certain time. The shadow was visible only to Lin Tang, as if he alone had been given the ability to see these signs. Lin Tang felt terrified and confused. He didn't know what the shadow of the calendar and clock meant, and he didn't dare to talk about it with anyone. However, as he began to note down and observe more closely, Lin Tang realized that the shadows of the dates and times always coincided with the death of a patient in that ward. Every time Lin Tang saw the shadow, The patient inside the ward would die exactly on the date and at the time shown by the shadow. Fear started to take hold of Lintang. How could he see something that no one else could? How could he know when someone would die just by looking at a ward's door? These thoughts made Lintang increasingly anxious and isolated. He felt burdened by the knowledge he didn't want, and he felt there was no one he could talk to about this. Every night, Lintang kept seeing the shadows, and every time he saw them, his feelings worsened. Guilt began to grow within him, even though he knew there was nothing he could do to change the patient's fates. However, the fact that he knew when someone would die made him feel as if he was somehow involved in their death, even if indirectly. Lintang tried to avoid looking at the ward doors, but somehow, he always felt drawn to see the shadows of the calendar and clock. Fear started to take hold of Lintang. How could he see something that no one else could? How could he know when someone would die just by looking at a ward's door? These thoughts made Lintang increasingly anxious and isolated. He felt burdened by the knowledge he didn't want, and he felt there was no one he could talk to about this. However, one day, after realizing that this ability was not something that could be ignored, Lintang took a different approach. As he passed one of the wards and saw the shadow of the date and time, he decided to act. With care and a great sense of responsibility, Lintang knocked on the ward door and subtly informed the patient's family inside. He suggested that they start contacting other family members without directly revealing what he knew. He simply said that it might be time to gather together to ensure that everyone important was by the patient's side. The responses from the patient's families varied. Some gratefully accepted Lintang's suggestion and immediately contacted other family members, while others were confused and skeptical. However, Lintang never forced his advice. He simply offered his suggestion in the most gentle way, leaving the decision up to the patient's family. In the nights that followed, Lintang continued this routine. Every time he saw the shadow on a ward door, he knocked and spoke to the patient's family. Sometimes, he witnessed families that had been separated gathering by their loved one's side, sharing their final moments together. Seeing them share last words, laughter, and tears made Lintang feel that perhaps there was a purpose to his ability. As time went on, news of Lintang's ability spread among the patients and their families in the hospital. What started as whispers in the hallways gradually became more widespread discussions. "There's a man who can predict when someone will die," people said. Although it sounded like an unfounded rumor, for those who had witnessed Lintang's accuracy in predicting deaths, the story became a frightening and mysterious reality. Lintang himself never intended to become the center of attention. However, the more often he gave warnings to patients' families, the more people began to seek him out. Some of them came with worried faces, pleading with him to tell them when their loved one's final moment would come. They had spent weeks, even months, in the hospital, watching their loved ones lie helpless, while they themselves grew increasingly mentally and physically exhausted. One night, an elderly woman approached Lintang in the hospital corridor. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her body trembled. She asked Lintang to come to the ward where her husband was being treated. "Please," she said with a quivering voice, "I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Can you tell me when his time will come? Lin Tang felt conflicted. He knew that every time he gave a warning, it meant the end was near. But he also understood the woman's suffering. With a heavy heart, Lin Tang agreed to accompany her. At the ward's door, as usual, Lin Tang saw the shadow of a calendar and the clock hands stopped at a certain time. He gently informed the woman, giving her enough time to prepare everything. The woman received the news calmly. She immediately contacted her children, ensuring they all gathered by her husband's side. A few hours later, her husband took his last breath surrounded by his family, providing a peaceful farewell moment. After that, stories about Lin Tang spread even further. People began openly inviting Lin Tang to the wards where their loved ones were being treated, asking for his predictions. Some immediately contacted other family members after hearing Lin Tang's estimate, ensuring they could all gather to say goodbye. Others contacted a notary, preparing the distribution of inheritance before the time came. Some even invited religious leaders, hoping to provide final spiritual care for their loved ones. Lin Tang began to feel as if he was in a situation he had never imagined before. His ability, which he initially saw as a curse, had now become something people sought. But behind all of this, Lin Tang still felt burdened. Every time he gave a prediction, he felt like he was delivering bad news. And although he knew that death is a natural part of life, the feeling of guilt continued to haunt him. However, on the other hand, Lin Tang also realized that his presence brought comfort to many people. By telling them when the final moment would arrive, Lin Tang gave them the opportunity to prepare, to say goodbye in a better way, to ensure that no words of apology were left unsaid or regrets left behind. The hospital, which had once felt like a place full of suffering and death for Lin Tang, now transformed into a place where he felt needed. Though the burden remained heavy, he began to accept that there might be a purpose behind his ability. And even though he couldn't save anyone's life, he could help those left behind to go through the difficult moments with a little more peace. One dark night, after almost a year in the hospital, Lin Tang walked towards his father's ward after a long day of work. As he approached the door of his father's ward, his heart pounded. His eyes automatically focused on the shadow on the door. The shadow of the calendar showed the date of tomorrow, and the clock hands pointed to 3 in the morning. Lin Tang felt an overwhelming wave of panic. He knew what that shadow meant. His father would die at the time shown. Panic overtook Lin Tang. He wanted to believe that this time might be different, that his father would survive. But deep down, he knew the truth. He knew that his father would not make it through the night. That night, Lin Tang sat beside his father's bed, holding his hand tightly. His father looked peaceful, as if he knew his time had come. Lin Tang tried to stay strong, even though his heart was breaking into pieces. As the clock's hands neared 3 in the morning, Lin Tang felt his heartbeat quicken. He wanted to stop time, wanted to beg fate to give them just a little more time together. But when the clock struck 3, his father took his last breath. Lin Tang did not cry. He was too shocked to feel anything. The world around him seemed to stop, leaving only a suffocating silence. After a moment, he bent down and kissed his father's forehead. tears beginning to flow uncontrollably. He knew this would happen, but still, the loss felt too heavy to bear. After his father's death, Lintang tried to continue with his life. He returned to work, but everything felt empty. The hospital, which had been a part of his life for the past year, was now a place he wanted to avoid. Though the strange ability to see the date and time of death seemed to vanish along with his father's passing, the memories of what he had experienced could not be erased. Lintang felt lost. Every day, he was reminded of his father's face, reminded of the clock that stopped precisely at 3 in the morning. He felt guilty, feeling that maybe he could have done something to stop what had happened, even though he knew it was impossible. He struggled to find his balance again, to move on with his life without being haunted by those dark memories. One day, after several months had passed, Lintang decided to return to the hospital, this time as a visitor, not as a grieving son. He walked through the familiar hallways, remembering every corner he had passed over the last year. When he arrived at the ward where his father had been treated, he felt a calm he had never felt before. Lintang looked at the calendar on the wall and the clock in the corner of the room. There were no premonitions, no fear. He just felt peace. Maybe, he thought, this was the universe's way of giving him a chance to say goodbye in a better way, to accept the reality that life and death are parts of a cycle that he must embrace. Lintang left the hospital with a different feeling. He knew that the memories of his father would always be in his heart, but he also knew that he didn't have to remain trapped in the past. Although the strange ability he once had was gone, the lessons he learned from that experience would always be a part of him. He learned that time is the most valuable thing, and although we can't control when our lives or those of our loved ones will end, we can choose to cherish every moment we have with them. With a firmer step, Lintang left the hospital, ready to continue with his life. He knew that the future was still full of uncertainty, but this time, he was ready to face it with greater courage. He had learned that although our time in this world is limited, we have the ability to make it meaningful.
Agar kalian tidak melewatkan kisah-kisah misteri berikutnya, subscribe dan klik lonceng notifikasi di bawah. Kami juga ingin mendengar komentar kalian tentang apa yang kalian pikirkan atau kisah menakutkan yang pernah kalian alami. Beranikan diri kalian untuk menulis di bawah. Hati-hati di luar sana, dan semoga kalian memiliki malam yang tenang.